So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to the 43rd NoBeC, or Norms and Behavioral Change Talk. My name is Samira, and I'm the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania. We have quite the compelling talk for you today, led by Professor Mario Maggioni, along with his co-author, Professor Domenico Rossignoli, both of whom are from the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. After their talk, we'll have a Q&A segment open to all participants towards the end of today's session. For those of you who may be new to this series or to the Center for Social Norms, the NoBeC talks are organized by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania with the support of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program and in partnership with the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. The center itself is a research center which provides specialized consulting, research, and training services to organizations throughout the world seeking to enact positive behavioral change. So here you can see the schedule of NoBeC talks that we have lined up through the end of this year with speakers from the following institutions, as you can see here: the University of Chicago, the National Research Council of Italy, Carnegie Mellon University, and the Norwegian School of Economics. You can visit our website for more information and to add these future talks to your calendar. And as a side note for our remaining talks, we also implore you to share any suggestions you may have of early career researchers, either current or recently graduated PhD candidates who may have interesting ongoing research that they can provide a brief presentation on. And later on, I'll provide my email address in the chat so that you can share any early career researcher suggestions that you may have. Lastly, before we get started, here are a few of our ground rules for today's session. We kindly ask that you mute yourself while the speakers are presenting. If possible, please keep your camera on so that we can have a more interactive and lively conversation. For any questions, you're welcome to use the chat at any time or raise your hand at the end of today's session when we have a Q&A. And lastly, the recordings of the NoBeC talks will be uploaded to our website, and the link is as follows. So now we move on to our main talk for today, which will be led by Professor Mario Maggioni with contributions from his co-author, Professor Domenico Rossignoli. Mario is a professor of economics at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan, Italy, where he is the program coordinator of the BSc course on International Relations and Global Affairs within the School of Political and Social Sciences. Mario is the director of the Department of International Economics, Institutions and Development, and of the Cognitive Science and Communication Research Center. He's published extensively in the fields of innovation, development, conflict, crime, robotics, and behavioral and experimental economics. And Mario's co-author, Domenico, is an assistant professor of economics, also at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. He teaches at the School of Political and Social Sciences, and his research and publications primarily focus on political economy and behavioral and experimental economics, with specific interests in institutions, development, conflict, education, and robotics. And just at this time, I'll stop sharing the screen so that Mario, you can go ahead and present. And while you do that, I'll share with everyone that Mario's talk today is on the following: if it looks like a human and speaks like a human, communication and cooperation in strategic human-robot interactions. And with that, we'll hand it over to you, Mario and Domenico. And thank you again both so much for joining us.
Okay, so thanks, Samira, for the introduction. I think you can all see my screen, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, and so just let's start. And as we said, question will be most unwelcome at the end. Just to start, we want to say that the topic is still on and hot, despite the fact that probably nowadays we are much more in the hype of AI, and we're still in robot. However, the two things are not so distant, and in a sense, you will see that in a moment, our experiment in a sense revealed that people were already they were already able or eager to see artificial intelligence even when artificial intelligence was not there. Just as a kind of motivation, you see that that is online interviews across 31 countries in 2020, and more than 1/3 of the interviews said that in the next future, robots will look like, think like, and speak like humans. So there was already this perception, and in the near future, that's why we start thinking about making an experiment willing to see how humans may react to a robot that is performing some sort of let's say dialogue, in a sense, a verbal reaction into a very defined and very restricted environment. So for decades, the human-robot interaction were mainly the topic for cultural and creative industry, i.e. science fiction. However, more recently, anthropomorphic social robots were diffusing out of labs and factories, especially in the interaction with what are called fragile human beings. So they were using for nursing homes, for kids care, and also in hospital. Now, social robots are a special type of machine in the sense that they are complex machine, they are anthropomorphic machine, and so they do not fit easily in the classical dichotomy that we usually use for interacting with machine, which is either a machine is working or the machine is not working, therefore is out of order. Now, if you interact with a machine which look like a human, then usually what happens is that sometimes this machine may happen that is not corresponding to the subject's own expectation. And therefore, in principle, a human being is expecting the machine to use verbal communication, because verbal communication is a trick, is a tool that humanity has developed as a way to reignite cooperation when something goes wrong. And that was the main idea. Now, there's a long tradition in philosophy, from Socrates to Martin Buber, from Gadamer to Habermas, but I just stop here because I know that I'm into a foreign field. I'm just a poor economist, and I don't want to question with people much well beyond my knowledge in philosophy. However, dialogue in all these contribution is seen as something which is both intrinsically human and also something that defines humans as compared to other species. Now, there are also some archaeological evidence from paleoanthropologists as well as paleoeconomists, which says that the higher ability of verbal communication of Homo sapiens was, in fact, the ability that gave a competitive advantage to Homo sapiens against Neanderthal. Now, that communication favor trust and cooperation is something that has been shown in several contributions in, let's say, the behavioral, experimental, and game theory literature. However, recent development of the social robotics and the human-robot interaction, so one is more the engineering kind of discipline, and the other is more human science side of this discipline, which look at human-robot interaction, show that there's really a new player in the scene, which are those robots which are able to communicate with human subject, both verbally and non-verbally. There's lots of empirical research in HRI in the last, let's say, 5 years, that devised a number of experiments in which human subjects were partnered with humanoid robots in different situations, and especially in social dilemma. Why social dilemma? Because social dilemma is a classical simple tools, however, that is able to be the test bed for cooperation and non-cooperation to happen, and therefore communication as a way to reignite trust and cooperation after cooperation, for example, went wrong. So our motivating question in really just one question would be, can communication reignite cooperation after something went wrong within a human-robot interaction? So just to go very short and brief on the related literature, we know that in both economic and psychology, and this field is really in between these two scientific disciplines, show the effect of communication and cooperation, usually moving the interaction towards a more cooperative result. On the critical social theory, identifies language as a binding force. That's the definition in strategic interaction. The contribution of HRI is that both verbal and non-verbal cue can shape the interaction between human subject and social robots. And there's a long tradition try to explain and try to analyze if it's the shape of the robots, if it's the moves of the robot, if it is the language of the robot, if it's the prosody of the robot. So different characteristics that the robot can use in order to engage the human subject. Now, there's a vast literature in so many different fields that show that players in general display different behavior and the neuroparts, neurological activation, when subjects are playing either against human subject or against automata. And here I'm using automata as a general umbrella terms, which takes into consideration robots, computer screen, and whatever, any artificial kind of agent. So we had to choose a robot. We choose the robot now. In a moment, I will show you, which is a robot which has become very popular in the HRI literature because it's small, it's portable, has a natural idle motion, i.e. when it is standing, it does not stand still, but it's quite natural. And it's also quite cute. So in general, it's very good in try to test interaction with human beings. So there's a meta-analysis by Robaczewski et al., which lists more than 200 experiments done with now. Out of them, 26 are focused on social interaction, and 5 within these 26 are looking at communication. Now, there's a paper that may look like similar to our paper, which is Sandoval et al. 2016, in which they ask subject to play a prisoner dilemma and ultimatum game against now. However, there are two main differences that we want to stress tonight, or this morning for you, which is that in Sandoval paper, in Sandoval experiment, both human and robots partner are always silent. So in a sense, robot does not talk, and also the human which act as a partner does not talk. So they are trying to limit the human representation of the robot also by limiting the human partner. And the second issue, which is, according to us, the main limitation of this paper, is that in order to perform the experiment, they have an experimenter within the room in which the interaction takes place. And to us, this presence is quite intrusive because we know that in a prisoner dilemma, you have to choose between a cooperative and a non-cooperative strategy. And we all know that there is a kind of social pressure towards cooperation. And therefore, the idea of performing the game while an experimenter, a person, is in the room may in fact influence the subject behavior. So this is our experimental design, is a classical and quite simple 2x2 treatment and experimental condition. So we have subject playing against either a human partner, a confederate agent, in a moment I will talk about that, or a robot, our now robot. And orthogonal to this experimental condition, there are two treatment groups. One is that the partner is performing what we call a verbal reaction. For now on, VR will stand for verbal reaction, i.e., after the first round of the game, the partner will react with a sentence that you will see is sort of pushing the action of the subject in the next round to be more cooperative. Or the no VR. Now the VR and no VR group, and no VR treatment, you will see, will be displayed according to a random algorithm of 0.5, i.e. 50% of the time, the partner will display a verbal reaction, and 50% of the time, the partner will not display a verbal reaction. This is our payoff matrix. As you see, is a classical prisoner dilemma. Is the original one. The Rappaport K-index is 1/3, so it's quite a symmetric kind of payoff matrix. And again, here, while the subject can choose between corporate and non-corporate, the partner, being human or robot, will always play randomly, half of the time corporate and half of the time not corporate. So our three research questions are as follows. The first one is, do subject cooperation rates differs according to partner types, i.e. are subjects more keen to cooperate with humans, with robots, or they behave similarly? The second one is, does a verbal reaction affect the behavior in the next round in terms of cooperation rates, i.e. a subject that receives a VR by a partner will cooperate more or less or the same after the VR has been performed? And the third one is the subject reaction to a VR depending on the partner's type, i.e. is a VR reaction by a human different from a VR action performed by a robot? Now, the results in a nutshell are as follows. The cooperation rate in general is higher with human partners than with robot partners. The second one, in line with the previous literature, is that the verbal reaction positively influences the subject cooperation rate. So when a VR is performed, the cooperation rate in the next round goes up. And the third one is that when a verbal reaction is present, however, the subject cooperation rate, either with humans or with robots, are almost the same. So a VR action is sort of reducing the kind of difference that we saw in the first result. Now, this is the longest and more complex slide in all my part, so just take a few moments to explain. So the experiment was based on two phases. Phase 1 was online and phase 2 was in the lab. Why we had an online phase of the experiment? Because in the first phase, we wanted subject to play the first round of the prisoner dilemma without knowing the nature of the partner. So in the email in which we invited students, rookies and sophomores to join, to answer some question and to play this game online, was under a veil of ignorance. We said your partner could be either a human or an artificial agent, and there were no way to know which was the partner the subject was playing against. Now, once they play the first round, we said in order to know the outcome of the first round, and you need to come to the lab. So there was a kind of incentive in order to know the outcome and to be paid. You come to the lab where you will receive the payoff, and you may be asked whether, if you want, to play some other rounds and some other games. So for the moment, I will skip the numbers. I will come back to the numbers in my last part slide. So we invited students through an email, and we just got the classical 10% response rate, which is usually the kind of standard between invitation online and people answering questionnaires or surveys. Then people were invited to book a session in the lab. I will just make a reference here to the fact that you see that there is quite a jump between the number of valid questionnaire in the online phases and the number of subjects of step 1, is because we were not very lucky with the choice of the moment in which we perform our experiment. It was during the 2 COVID pandemics, the two wave of COVID pandemics. So in fact, every time we launch the session, we had to interrupt the experiment because universities in Italy were closed because of the lockdown that was imposed by law. However, this may act as a sort of explanation, say that the big reduction in number is not meaning that we have a self-selection, because in a sense there were just people that were booking the session and they just couldn't come because of the lockdown. So to those who came to the lab, they were revealed the type of partner because they enter a room and they saw either a human, our confederate agent, or a robot. And we said to these people, you played against this robot, you play against this student. And these are the results. The results were shown to the subjects. And after the results they were shown, in case of the VR treatment, the partner would say a sentence that in a moment I will tell you that was in fact really outcome contingent. So depending on the kind of outcome that happened in the round 1, the partner said a sentence that was moving the interaction towards cooperation. Now, after the VR or the non-VR has been performed, then we ask students whether they wanted to come over for, they wanted to make another round of the same game. And you see that 95% of the students agree to go for another round. And then there was a prisoner dilemma, again, round 2, that was performed in the lab. And after that, just to a tiny share of the students, just the 15%, we also proposed to go for a 3rd round. In fact, all our analysis is based on step 2, and we just add to a 15% of the population to go to round 3, because we wanted to avoid students communicating and just telling, okay, you go there and you just play 2 games. So 5% was stopped after step 1, and 85% were stopped after round 2. So contrary to Sandoval, we make the framework and the experimental room so that subject couldn't see the experimenter that was in a control room, but totally hidden from the sight of the subject. The partners was, as I said, either a human, a confederate agent, which were either graduate or PhD students of ours that were performing exactly as the robot was performed. So in a sense, we just wanted to have a perfect counterfactual action to those performed by the robot. So also the human partners was playing randomly, half of the time cooperate, half of the time not cooperate. And half of the time they were requested to make an explanation, a verbal reaction, and half of the time not. Now, important, before the interaction started, both the confederate agent and the robot greeted the subject. So the human was just saying, hi, my name is so-and-so, and what's your name? And the robot will say, I'm now a social robot designed to interact with human. What's your name? So that may seem just a tiny sentence. However, we wanted to exclude that the effect that we get as a result is not just because the robot is talking, because the robot is talking to everyone, both to the VR and to the non-VR subject. However, what is important is, in fact, the content of the verbal reaction. So this is just a graphical representation of the control room. So the subject were entering from the door on the top right, while the partner was entering from what the subject thought was another corridor, but in fact was the control room. At your left, there was either the robot or the human partner, and on your right, there was the chair for the subject. Now you see that on the back of each position, there was a TV screen, because the results were displayed on these two large TV screen, and also read by a voiceover that was present in the room. So in fact, this is the picture of the actual room when the robot was in. Now you see that now is quite small, so we couldn't have now seated on the chair, but we just put now on the table, and we also need a small table in order to have the button, because the choice of the students were performed by pushing either a C or an N button, C for cooperate and N for not cooperate. So this is now is something like 50 centimeters, 20 inches tall. And these are the numbers. So we sent a total of 23,500 emails. We received 2,200 answers. However, just 1,800 were valid and completed questionnaire. So of those 1,800, almost 97% agree to participate in phase 2. That is probably due also to the fact that we say we will pay you only if you come to the lab. I already talked about the outbreak of COVID-19 in both 2020 and 2021. So at the end, you will see, and I think that Domenico will mainly deal with that, with two samples on which our analysis is based. One, which is called full sample of 490 subjects, and another sample, which is called the main sample, which is the one on which VR could be performed. And in a moment, I will show why, which is 305 subjects. Now, these are the verbal reaction. Now, you see that the verbal reaction are definitely related to the kind of outcome. So when the outcome in round 1 was that the subject cooperate and the partner was not cooperating, half of the time, the partner was stating an apology. Something like, I realize I made a mistake in our online interaction. I meant to press C to cooperate. However, I pressed N by mistake. I'm really sorry. I will be more careful next time. In case the outcome was just the opposite, so the subject was non-cooperating and the partner was cooperating, there was a reprimand. I'm really upset. If you had chosen to cooperate, we would have gained €6 each, a reasonable amount. On the contrary, you exploited my goodwill and I got nothing. And third, when both the subject and the partner didn't cooperate, there was what we call the disappointment, which is, what a pity. If we had chosen to cooperate, we would have gained €6 each. Why not cooperate in the next round? Now you see that the first possible state of the world, i.e. both players were cooperating, have no VR. And we decided not to have any VR because we wanted VR to move the cooperation back, to move the interaction back to cooperation where something went wrong. So when they were already cooperating, we decided not to have any further influence. Now, the robot was automatically performing the VR. The subject instead was reading the outcome on the screen, and it was able to look at the shape that you see were outside the numbers of the outcome in order to know that when the outcome was in a round shape, the partner will stay silent without making any verbal reaction. And when the outcome were instead as a triangle, they will just make an apology. As a square, they make a reprimand. And as an hexagon, they will just say, what a pity. And I will just stop here and leave the floor to Domenico for the results and the econometric analysis. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mario. Just a second. That
you can share your screen.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you should see my screen now. So here we are with the results, the main results of our experiment. So well, first of all, this is a summary really of what happened in the lab and online relating to the sample that we actually consider. So if you look at this table, looks a bit complicated, but that's because of the 2x2 nature of our experiment. So row wise, you see what we call the experimental conditions. So whether the partner was a robot or a human, the confederate agent that Mario explained before. And across columns, you see whether the treatment, so the verbal reaction, was assigned or not to the subject. So looking at this table, what is the most important thing that that appears, that if you look at all the lines labeled cooperate online, so those referring to the choices that the subjects made in the online phase. So before knowing anything about the partner they would be matched in the lab, you see that basically there's no statistical difference between the cooperation rates in the groups that then would be formed in the lab. So this is to ensure that we are not self-selecting basically people depending on some kind of types that may be captured by their choice on the online stage of the experiment. Okay, but if you look at the cooperate rate in the lab, so when people actually show up for performing the experiment, so after either receiving the VR or not receiving the VR, the cooperation rate is larger when the verbal reaction is assigned, both for subjects partnered with a robot and for subjects partnered with a human. And in both cases, these differences are statistically significant. Okay, and finally, if you compare across treatment groups, so but by different types of partners, so you see that the only statistical difference that you can still see is when you compare subjects partnered with a robot versus subjects partnered with a human in the control group, so meaning that when no verbal reaction was assigned. So this first summary statistics is suggesting that actually something is happening in the lab that is making people behaving differently depending on both partner type and the presence of a treatment. On average, we observed pretty high cooperation rates overall, but this is fairly consistent with the most recent estimates of cooperation rates in the prisoner's dilemma in Italy. According to a recent meta-analysis, it is about 50%, so we're not that far. When no verbal reaction is assigned, we have seen that the robot condition exert a significantly lower cooperation rate. So meaning that when subjects face a robot, on average, they are less likely to cooperate in the prisoner dilemma. And again, in general, when the verbal reaction is assigned, cooperation rates are larger, both in the robot and human condition. And so in the robot and human condition, this difference is not statistically different. Okay, so to see more precisely what we mean, we wanted to address our 3 research questions. So the 3 research questions that Mario showed at the beginning. So whether partner type, whether verbal reaction affects the cooperation rates, and whether there's a heterogeneity across people facing a human or robot partner in any potential effect of the verbal reaction. We addressed these 3 questions by a simple model, actually, in which we estimated the probability of cooperating in the second step, so when subjects were in the lab, okay? Conditionally on a very simple model specification, in which we are saturating a model in which we consider whether the subject was a partner with a robot or with a human, whether he or she was assigned to a treatment or not, and also the interaction between our conditions. Okay, we also control for the choice of the subject in the online phase of the experiment, and for a further set of control variables, such as, for example, experiment-related controls, such as the days of the experiment, the waves of the experiment, and other background characteristics of the subject that we collected through the online questionnaires. So these delta 1, 2, and 3 are the main coefficient of interest, and are the coefficients that I am going to briefly comment in this final part of the presentation. So this is a coefficient plot representing a summary of our main results. So if you start looking at the VR and robot sections, you see that the estimated effects are statistically different from 0. Also, in this case, when we exclude people that failed the comprehension test that we administered before starting the experiment. Okay, so just to have also as a robustness test a more, let's say, precise sample of people that fully understood the task. Also, in this case, we always got statistically significant results. In this case, it is not at the 5%, but as you can see in a while in the table, it is statistically significant at the 10%. Okay, so this coefficient plot is just telling you that on average, being assigned to the treatment group, so observing a verbal reaction by the partner, positively affects the cooperation rates in the lab, while being facing the robot instead of a human, ceteris paribus, is negatively affecting cooperation rates. But very interestingly, these 2 effects are not heterogeneous in terms of partner type. So what does it mean? That the interaction term is not statistically different from 0. So there's no difference in the effect of the verbal reaction in the robot and human sample. And this is even clearer, of course, in the table, where you see that while the VR and robot coefficient are always statistically significant at the conventional thresholds, the interaction term is never significant. Okay, so this is telling that both when people face a robot partner and when people face a human partner, being assigned to the group in which, depending on the outcome observed in the previous round online of the prisoner dilemma, the partner operates a kind of verbal reaction that is somewhat, gently pushing towards cooperation, well, this verbal reaction is affecting the behavior of the subjects, both in the human and in the robot sample. So this is, we think, an interesting result, because it is suggesting that if the humanoid robot, even if it is very simple, and as in the case of now, is able to perform a verbal reaction that is consistent with the very simple situation that we created in the lab, well, people are on average trusting this robot, and so they will in the next step be more likely to cooperate with the robot itself. We also tried a number of robustness checks to test for potential sources of bias in our result, because, for example, the literature has shown that economic students, in this case for econ students, we mean students of our university that are enrolled in economics, finance management, banking and insurance programs. And so the literature has shown that these students tend to perform differently from other kind of students when they are playing a prisoner's dilemma. We try to minimize this issue by choosing mostly first year and also second year students, but still, if this result, maybe if this source of bias may be present, it could affect our results. So we try this by excluding econ student from the sample. Clearly, the power of the statistical analysis now decreases, but still you see that the overall result holds. And this is even clearer when you look at the table, in which more or less, most of the coefficients are the same as I showed you before in the previous table. Okay. We also try to assess biases due to psychological and behavioral traits of subjects by including a sort of, we would say, usual known suspects about potential effects, such as, for example, a risk scale, a trust scale, an intertemporal discount rate, and also a very simple proxy of generosity that was constructed by asking subjects to whether they wanted or not to donate €1 out of their gains in the experiment to a NGO of their choice among a list of 2 different, Greenpeace and Médecins Sans Frontières. So, but as you can see, none of these variables is statistically significant, even though they are helping improving a little bit the precision of the estimate, but still the main result is the same as I showed you in the simplest version of the model. So again, also psychological and behavioral traits are not the main driving force in our results. Same is true for the choice made by the partner online. This is just a sort of technical check, because this is related also with the outcome. And probably more interestingly, our results are not affected by the perception of robots that subjects had, because in the online questionnaire, so before knowing the nature of the partner, we asked subjects a very simple question about their perception of robots' behavior that could basically summarize into a binary variable, whether they thought the robot is, we could say, adaptive, meaning that it tends to adapt to the subject's behavior, so implying a kind of artificial intelligence or something like that in the perception of the humanoid robot, or whether people basically think that the robot is just a a tool that is performing a fixed set of rules that depends on a given algorithm. Okay, so if we use this further variable, again, you see that the triple interaction between these new variables, so whether people think that the robot is adaptive or not, is not driving the result. So again, this is interesting because what really makes a difference is again what happens in the lab. So whether people observe or not the robot performing the verbal reaction. So just to come to a conclusion, the literature has already shown that what has been considered for a long time just cheap talk, so just talk that information that is not directly affecting payoffs actually affects the behavior of subjects even in strategic settings. So our experiment shows that this is confirmed for what is related to the human sample, in the sense that what we see is that subjects that are facing a human partner that performs a verbal reaction tend to cooperate more than those subjects that are facing a human partner that does not perform a verbal reaction. So this is in line with the existing literature. But what we add to this literature is that this is true even in the case of social robots. And most interestingly, the way this verbal reaction is affecting the behavior of subjects facing a robot is not statistically different from the way the verbal reaction affects people facing a human being. So in some way, it is like we are stressing that a very important intimate features of human beings is being able to communicate and to communicate meaningfully. So something that is related to the context. So as we try to do by making our verbal reaction related to the outcome that was experienced in the previous step of the experiment. And this tool is so strong in determining the perception of being a human that when it is incorporated even in a very simple way as we did in our experiment, it is also probably potentially increasing the perception of a social robot as a more similar to a human being. So clearly in our experiment, we know that there are also potential limitations. So first of all, our experiment was performed on weird subjects, so wide educated, industrialized, etc. So we know that potentially our result could be different in different contexts, and we think that it could be also interesting to explore this further question. But we think that our results suggest also potential implications in cases robots are used to interact with fragile, especially fragile human beings, because we are stressing the fact that it's fundamental that the robot is able to communicate in a way that is context specific, because that is the crucial thing, making the social robot appearing as as being actually present in the situation rather than just performing random sentences to try and appear more human. Also, we know that our main result may depend on the belief that if a robot is able to implement a verbal reaction, then is perceived as more human. As I said, this is a suggestion. Okay, so we think that this could be one of the potential explanation, but clearly we cannot exclude that an alternative interpretation is that just the mere enunciation of a pro-social statement, such as, that cooperating is morally superior than not cooperating, could be affecting our result. We're not able at this stage to disentangle these two potentially different mechanisms. A possible test could be to have VR partners against neutral voiceover, for example, commenting suboptimal outcomes. But clearly, on this, there are also other suggestions that we could take. So thank you for your attention. We are really eager to have your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mario and Domenico, for this fascinating talk. And now we'll just go directly into the Q&A from here. What we ask participants is that please feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, or put any additional questions in the chat. I see there's 2 questions already, so we can get started there. There's a question from Luca, which says, did you conduct structured or semi-structured interviews with subjects after the experiment to understand how they felt in the VR condition with the robot partner?
No, we were teaming with some psychologists that they were suggesting to have this part. However, the interaction was already quite structured, and we had the idea, of fitting as many people per day in these slots. And so the only things that there was performed, and we are working with this team of psychologists, we just perform there was one question, so it was definitely not an interview, was not a structured interview, using a scale which is attribution of mental states, but that didn't seem to be very able to capture the different reaction to VR robots versus non-VR robots. I saw that before that in the chat there was also another question, just a clarification question. Yes, the human greeted the subject in person as well. As I said, the idea was that my name is Mario, how are you, and how is your name? So in fact, we try to have exactly the human being a partner and a confederate agent performing exactly as the robot. Could the subject see the partner throughout the experiment? Yes, as you see, they were seated on the 2 extremes of a table, so they were always looking at the partner. And that's why we were very happy to use now, because even when he's not moving, because then now was moving one arm in order to reach one of the 2 buttons, but even when he was not moving and it was idle, the nice things about now is that it's not really stiff. So it's giving an impression of a, say, living agent. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Mario. There's another question from Samin. He says, or they say, do you think the results would be different if they couldn't see each other?
Yeah, however, we said that, if they couldn't see each other, then that would be much similar to most of the literature which is already present, which is, computer-mediated kind of interaction. Now, you could even think about, okay, I'm interacting through a computer screen with a robot. Yes, we thought that was not so relevant. However, we also thought that is a kind of similar answer to your question. We thought about making an interaction. We are still thinking about doing it, i.e. to see whether to have the robot in presence in the same room, so sharing ecologically the environment in which the subject is immersed, as compared to a subject wearing a Google, an enhanced vision Google, in which he could see the robot as just performing in this virtual reality space. So that's something we are thinking about, and we are teaming with some other researcher here at the Cattolica University, and probably that could be a possible extension. So comparing real presence in the same physical space versus co-sharing of a virtual reality space.
Great, thank you, Mario. And also, Samin, thank you for your questions. We have another 5 minutes before we're going to conclude. So folks, please feel free to raise your hand or speak up. In the meantime, while folks might be sending in more questions, I have a question for you, Mario. Domenico spoke about the implications of this research. And I wanted to hear from your side as well. It was mentioned that there may be implications on cases where robots are used to interact with often fragile human beings.
Yeah.
So if there's more that you have to add on implications and also where the research goes from here.
Thanks, Amira. In fact, I was willing to add just a sentence at the end of the paper saying that the original research question we started with was, is it easier to forgive a robot or a human being? So at the beginning, we thought about just focusing on what we call the apology, i.e. I'm interacting with the robot is doing something against me, which is something that, I just thought about my experience with my old age mother. And when you care for some, for example, old people, then sometimes the old people just get angry at you without any kind of reason, just because you couldn't really understand what they need or something like that. And in a sense, what is important, human beings, when something happens like that, tend to give explanation in order to re-establish the interaction. And that's something that I think that if we want to use robots, either with children or with sick people or with elderly, we need to have robots that not just try always to abide to the request of the fragile person, because sometimes the request of the fragile person is not good for the subject. So sometimes you have to say no, but in a nice way. And if the subject gets a kind of bad reaction, then you need to reestablish this kind of trust. And so I know that, I'm building a huge castle out of a very simple experiment, but that was our main motivating idea. Then we thought about why just focus on 1 out of 4 possible states of the world. And that's why we added also the reprimand and the what a pity. But yeah, in fact, our main focus, and you see that also the largest number, so we can say that most of the results are in fact driven by the apology, i.e. a robot or a person that is behaving in a non-cooperative way, and then he asks the subject, is sending an apology in order to re-establish a kind of cooperative interaction.
Great, thank you, Mario. We have 2 more questions and we'll conclude, I think, with these 2 questions. And the first of them is, does the VR always act on the subject in the same way, changing his second decision towards cooperation?
Domenico, you want to...
Yeah, if I understood correctly the question, you mean whether we have variance in the choice at the second stage? Well, yes, in the sense that the verbal reaction acted on the subject by increasing the probability of cooperation, but we have also clearly cases in which it didn't work that way. So sometimes people simply do not cooperate. So.
Okay. Great. And then another question is, in which sense the ex post item on the attribution of mental states does not explain variation in results?
In the sense that we couldn't find any significant difference about the attributional mental state of robots that were performing a VR or a non-VR. However, the attributional mental state is just it was a scale that was developed by these fellow psychologists. They were sort of testing also the scale. We don't think that this is in fact capturing the complexity of the reaction, because in a sense, some of the questions were, do you think the robot can smell? Do you think the robot can enjoy music or something like that? I mean, there was, seems to me, they were sort of very general scale, try to give an attribution of mental state, i.e. human kind of characteristics. However, in our case, I would have used just a more restricted kind of scale that is just sort of relating to the fact of changing the behavior in response to the situation or in response to what the subject has done, something like that. That's my, but we are still, so we sort of added this part of things, and then we say we may develop a second paper, and the fact that we don't have a second paper probably is telling you that for the moment we are not really happy with the kind of results. It's not that we got a different things, it's that it's not significant. So, you know, that's the worst case for a scientist.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you, Mario, for that. And then the actual last question. Thank you, Luca, as well for your questions. There's one last question from Cornelia, and she's asking, would it have made a difference if the technological agent would not have been incorporated, but simply been an AI voice?
No, that would be, in fact, the possible on the same spectrum of the idea of having, you know, just a voice, just a robot in a VR environment, you know, that you can think about, you know, now that we have we are mostly, let's say, used to interact with chat box. So in a sense, that could be just a more a usual kind of interaction. What we wanted to have at this stage, in fact, was the idea. And in a sense, we may think that the fact of having our robot was, in fact, you know, just a metal box of plastic and metal, and it was just reacting to the outcome according to a fixed program. However, because the verbal reaction really was connected with the outcome, even just that is giving the impression to people that the robot was present in the situation. So in a sense, now about these things, about the hype of the ChatGPT, and sometimes there is already news in the paper, there are people developing an addiction in chatting with ChatGPT. Now, I just say that in a sense, humans are eager to attribute meaning to any kind of agent they interact, any kind of object. I mean, we are all scientists and very rational. However, I'm pretty sure that every one of us remember once in which we just scream at the computer because it just failed before we could save an important file. And there's no reason to do that because the computer is not and the one responsible and is not reacting to insult. However, that's something that happened to us, or, you know, just kicking a tire when the car is not working. So that's something that could be part of human being. I don't want to start with, you know, ancient religion and idols, something like that. But in a sense, we tend to attribute human characteristics to objects. So in a sense, I think that we're really, it's very easy for a human being to buy the meaning, the presence of consciousness within an object that is interacting. And that is even easier when the object look like a human being and it move like a human being and talk like a human being. So it's kind of the classical duck test. So in a sense, now imagine what would happen with now that is activating an artificial intelligence. Now, probably the main problem there would be that would be quite difficult to have a perfect counterfactual with human, because an artificial intelligence is reacting to what the subject is saying. So in a sense, would be slightly more difficult to say that I'm really testing an artificial intelligence against a confederate partners, because the confederate partners will have some difficulties in replicating exactly the kind of interaction of an artificial intelligence. But that's just, you know, from the top of my mind, probably have to think more about that. And thanks, Cornelia, for the question.
Great, thank you so much, Mario, and agreed. Thank you, Cornelia, for that question. So we're now up on time. Thank you, everyone, all of the participants, for your attendance and for your questions. Our deep appreciation goes to Mario and Domenico for your very comprehensive talk and contributions. And we just want to give everyone a heads up that we're going to have a little bit of a summer break with the NoBeC talks, but we'll be back on Thursday, September 7th, with our next talk with Dr. Alex Imas from the University of Chicago. And so thank you all again, and we look forward to your continued participation in the NoBeC talks.